The sun beat down on Kambara, a relentless hammer forging the red earth into a tableau of heat and dust. It was a land of stark beauty and harsher realities, where the ancient rhythms of the savannah clashed with the jarring discord of modern conflict. The heat wasn't just physical, it was a constant pressure, mirroring the political and social furnace Kambara had become. In this crucible, IBRAHIM TRAORÉ had risen. Not a man of inherited power or academic pedigree, but a son of the soil, forged in the punishing sun and tempered by the relentless struggle for survival that defined life for most Cumberances. He was a soldier who had witnessed his nation's agony firsthand, the systemic grip of corruption that siphoned away hope, the festering scar of insurgency that bled communities dry, and the insidious creep of foreign influence, often cloaked in seemingly benevolent terms, yet ultimately corrosive to national dignity. He had seized control in a moment of national desperation, a spontaneous combustion of frustration and patriotic fervor, pledging to restore Kambara's trampled sovereignty, secure its porous borders, and reclaim the lost dignity of its long-suffering people. But pledges, Traoré knew with a weary certainty, were like the very sand the wind scattered, fine and promising when spoken, yet fragile and easily dispersed without a solid, unwavering foundation beneath them. And Kambara's foundation was not merely crumbling, it was fracturing under immense pressure. Islamist extremist groups, fueled by shadowy foreign money and exploiting local grievances, plagued the vast, arid expanse of the north. They brought terror, displacement, and a fundamental challenge to the state's authority. The economy staggered under the crushing weight of unsustainable debt, often incurred under previous, less scrupulous regimes, and the continued, often rapacious, exploitation of its valuable mineral resources by external players. And perhaps most perilously, the shadow of external military intervention loomed, ever present, ever watchful, sometimes openly acknowledged, sometimes operating in the murky depths of clandestine operations, invariably cloaked in the guise of aid, security cooperation, or stabilization efforts, but serving interests that were decidedly not Kambara's own. Operating within these pervasive shadows was a group known locally only as the Vanguard. They were not conventional American soldiers, identifiable by standard uniforms and clear chains of command visible to the public eye. Instead, they were an elite composite, highly trained special operations personnel, private military contractors operating with sophisticated hardware and ambiguous legal standing, and a network of advisors embedded within various sectors, ostensibly to improve local capacity. They operated in a gray zone, a space defined by plausible deniability and objectives that shifted with the geopolitical winds. Officially, their mission was counterterrorism, supporting local forces against the very insurgents who were tearing the country apart. But in the eyes of many in Kambara, from the market vendor in the capital to the farmer in a remote village, their true purpose was less about protecting Cumberances and more about safeguarding interests that had little to do with the welfare or aspirations of the Cumberance people: strategic positioning, resource access, regional influence. They were efficient, professionally ruthless, equipped with cutting-edge technology that made the Cumberance military look like relics, and, until recently, they seemed utterly untouchable, operating with an air of absolute authority on Cumberance soil. Traoré sat in his Spartan office in the presidential palace, a relic of colonial architecture that had seen significantly better days, its paint peeling, its infrastructure creaking, tracing lines across a large, worn map of Kambara spread across his heavy wooden desk. Red pins marked the chilling locations of insurgent attacks, each pin a silent scream of loss and brutality. Blue pins indicated areas under the precarious, often temporary, control of his loyal, but under-equipped forces. Green pins, frustratingly few and clustered mainly around major towns, showed the few villages where people could dare to sleep without the constant, gnawing dread of a midnight incursion, a raid, or senseless violence. He glanced at the date on the calendar. Another day slipping away, marked by reports of death, displacement, and dwindling resources. The pressure was a physical weight on his chest. The vanguard was growing bolder, their operations expanding their reach, edging dangerously close to the country's heartland. Their patrols were more frequent, their overflights more intrusive. Rumors circulated in hushed tones, whispers picked up by a strained intelligence network, often from frustrated Cumbrance officers within joint operations or civilians weary of the foreign presence, about a plan to neutralize the current leadership, replacing it with a more cooperative, more pliable regime. Traoré felt the noose tightening, not around his neck personally, but around the sovereignty of the nation he had sworn to protect. Beside the map lay a dusty, slightly faded photograph, a cherished artifact in a room stripped bare of luxuries. It was a picture of his parents and younger sister, taken years ago, a memory frozen in time. They had been killed in an attack, a stark reminder of the violence that had long plagued Kambara, long before his own ascent to power. That grief had been the crucible that forged him, the driving force that propelled him to take the drastic steps he had taken. He had sworn in the silent chambers of his heart that no other family in Kambara would suffer the same agonizing fate, the same arbitrary cruelty on his watch. But looking at the map, at the relentless advance of the red pins, at the overwhelming technological superiority represented by the vanguard's presence, he felt himself failing that sacred promise. His chief of staff, Captain Aminata Diallo, entered the room, a woman whose quiet strength was as palpable as the heat, her gaze sharp and unwavering, a reflection of her deep commitment and intelligence. She held a tablet, her expression grave. "Mr. President, reports from the north. A humanitarian aid convoy was attacked near Buram. Our people escorting it suffered heavy losses. The insurgents, they were particularly brutal this time. No survivors among the aid workers." Traoré closed his eyes for a brief moment, the sheer weight of the news a physical blow, adding another layer to the burden he carried. Aid for his own people, desperately needed, callously robbed, destroyed, with the lives of those trying to deliver it extinguished. "And the vanguard?" he asked, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and rising anger. "They have aerial surveillance in that sector. Were they aware of the convoy's route? The timings?" Aminata hesitated, her gaze flicking down at the tablet. "Our informants within the Joint Operational Center suggest they were. They did not intervene. The attack lasted over an hour. There are whispers, Mr. President, disturbing whispers, that they allowed the attack to happen, that their assets in the area were deliberately repositioned or experienced technical difficulties. To what end? To demonstrate our government's inability to protect even vital aid. To show our people and the international community that we are failing. To create the conditions for something else." A cold, dangerous anger, sharper and more focused than the grief, kindled in Traoré's eyes. It was not the first time he suspected that the vanguard, despite their official mandate, was more interested in maintaining a state of controlled chaos, a perpetual low-grade conflict, than in genuinely eradicating the threat, using the pretext of counterterrorism as a convenient and internationally palatable justification for their presence and the projection of foreign power and influence. They wanted Kambara weak, unstable, dependent, and therefore controllable. "Mr. President," Aminata continued, her voice lower now, acknowledging the unspoken implications of her report, "our resources are stretched beyond their limit. The national defense and security forces are loyal, yes, fiercely loyal, but we lack the basic equipment, the real-time intelligence feed they possess, the overwhelming rapid response capability that their technology affords them." She gestured towards the screen of the tablet, which displayed clear, high-resolution satellite images, images that had not come from the usual Western partners, who had suddenly become less forthcoming with critical data of the Vanguard's main base, bristling with attack helicopters, sophisticated surveillance drones, advanced armored vehicles, and communication arrays that dwarfed anything the Cumbrians' military possessed. "They are monitoring us. Every signal we send, every vehicle movement, probably every significant conversation within these walls. They are inside our networks, inside our lives. They are inside our country, acting like they own it." Traoré rose from his desk, the wormwood creaking softly in the quiet room, and walked to the window, gazing down at the dusty city below. The late afternoon light cast long shadows. He could see children playing in the street, their laughter a fragile defiance against the hardship. He saw women carrying impossibly heavy burdens on their heads, their backs bent but their strides purposeful. He saw the tireless movement of people striving for normalcy, for survival, for a flicker of hope. Life carrying on, resilient, despite the constant, oppressive threat that hung over them like the dust itself. For them, for these people, he needed to find a solution. He needed a way to push back the shadows, to create space for Kumbara to breathe, to heal, to build. He had tried the traditional channels. Repeated appeals to the international community, to former colonial powers, to Western partners, for more support, real military support, economic aid without crippling conditions, and, crucially, for genuine respect for Kumbara's sovereignty. He had received platitudes, expressions of sympathy, promises of future assistance, and photo opportunities. But he had received little tangible action, or the action that came was accompanied by so many political and economic conditionalities, so many requirements to align with external agendas, that it felt less like aid and more like the tightening of a golden leash, less like assistance and more like being lured into a finely crafted cage. The Vanguard, he knew with a chilling certainty that permeated his very bones, was preparing for something significant, something decisive. The fragments of intelligence, painstakingly pieced together from sources operating at great personal risk, from chance intercepts, from the gut feelings of experienced officers, all pointed to an imminent operation. A coordinated series of actions aimed at large-scale government destabilization, perhaps a swift, targeted decapitation strike, possibly culminating in a direct action against the presidential palace itself. They wouldn't call it a coup. They would frame it as a necessary counterterrorism measure, a surgical intervention to prevent state collapse, a narrative easily sold to an international community weary of instability. The internal designation, Operation Clean Sweep, captured the clinical, ruthless intent. Commander Hayes, at the Vanguard's sprawling, well-fortified base, felt a different kind of pressure. He was a professional soldier, disciplined and effective, with years of experience navigating the complexities and moral ambiguities of conflict zones across the globe. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had dedicated his life to military service, that his mission was necessary, even vital. He saw Traoré not as a national hero, but as an impediment, a nationalist ideologue, perhaps well-intentioned but ultimately naive and stubborn, whose resistance to cooperation and rational policy, read, policies aligned with Western interests, was actively hindering the efforts to stabilize Kumbara and combat the very real terrorist threat. The mission, as he understood it, filtered down through layers of command and strategic objectives, was to ensure that Kumbara did not fall completely into the abyss of terrorist control, but also that its leadership was reliable, pragmatic, and aligned with the broader strategic goals of his government and its allies. Traoré, with his fiery rhetoric about sovereignty and independence, was demonstrably neither. Hayes trusted his technology implicitly. He trusted the training and capabilities of his men and women absolutely. They were the best, equipped with the most advanced tools the world had to offer. They were superior in every technical and tactical aspect to Traoré's ragtag, under-equipped forces. The insurgency was a problem, a persistent enemy, but one they could contain, manage, and eventually degrade, provided the political landscape was favorable. The only variable he considered minor, perhaps even negligible, were the vague whispers about Traoré seeking support in other parts of the world. Africa, Hayes and his superiors believed, was largely spoken for, a domain where certain powers held sway, and no one else would dare to openly challenge their hegemony there, not in a meaningful way that would impact military operations on the ground. Night fell over the capital, bringing a brief, precious relief from the searing heat, but intensifying the pervasive sense of imminent threat. The city lights twinkled, a fragile defiance against the encroaching darkness and uncertainty. Traoré did not sleep. He remained in his office, the only light a desk lamp casting long shadows, pondering his options in the suffocating silence. Resisting the vanguard alone, attempting to confront their overwhelming technological and firepower superiority, meant a brutal, one-sided conflict, the potential for widespread urban warfare, unnecessary bloodshed, perhaps the swift fall of his government, and the guaranteed descent of Kambara into an even deeper, more protracted chaos that the insurgents would eagerly exploit. Ceding power or yielding to the vanguard's demands, allowing them free rein to operate and dictate policy, meant betraying everything he had fought for, everything his family had died for. It meant surrendering the hard-won, fragile notion of his country's sovereignty, handing control back to external forces whose interests had historically been detrimental to his people. There was a third path, a dangerous and controversial option he had been considering with growing reluctance, wrestling with the moral and political implications. It was the path that the title of our story mentioned directly. A path that many of his traditional allies would instantly condemn, denouncing it with predictable vehemence. But it seemed, in the cold, hard light of his assessment, the only door left open, when all the others were either firmly shut or led directly into carefully constructed traps. He called Aminata back into the office in the pre-dawn hours, the darkness of night beginning to yield to the first gray light. "Captain," he said, his voice low and weary, but firm with resolve. "Prepare a secure communication. Highest level encryption. We need to enter into contact with Moscow." Aminata's expression remained composed, showing no outward surprise, only a grim, shared understanding of the monumental nature of the decision. She knew, as well as he did, that this was not a simple diplomatic overture. This was a pivot, a high-stakes gamble with profound, unpredictable ramifications, a move that could fundamentally change Kambara's place in the world and its internal power dynamics, for better or for worse. It was a decision born of desperation, a last resort when faced with an existential threat from an unexpected quarter. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension, clandestine communications, and agonizing waiting. The contact was made through tortuous channels, leveraging what few discrete connections Kambara had outside its traditional spheres of influence, channels designed to bypass the ubiquitous surveillance of hostile intelligence agencies. The initial response from Moscow was cautious, pragmatic, measured. They were not sentimental actors on the world stage. They were not interested in sending mass troops for a direct, costly military intervention in West Africa that could draw them into a proxy war they weren't yet ready for, at least not in the simplistic way that some in Kambara might have initially hoped. A savior army to fight their battles for them. What Traoré needed, and what he articulated through layers of intermediaries and carefully worded messages, was not a Russian army marching through Kambara's streets. That, he understood, would merely be trading one form of external control for another, a different colored flag flying over the foreign bases. What he needed was a shield. Not a physical barrier made of steel and concrete, but a strategic, diplomatic, and perhaps technical shield, a series of actions and signals that would raise the cost of a direct intervention by the vanguard and their patrons to a level that was simply too high, too risky, even for powers accustomed to operating with impunity. He needed something that would force the vanguard to halt their advance, to abandon Operation Clean Sweep, to retreat, without a single Cumbrance or Russian soldier necessarily having to fire a shot at them directly. The negotiations were complex, difficult, and laden with implicit demands and potential future obligations. Moscow saw a clear opportunity, a chance to gain a foothold, expand its influence, and challenge the perceived hegemony of Western powers in a region where they felt their own interests had been historically neglected or actively undermined. Traoré saw a lifeline, a slender thread of hope in a situation of imminent collapse. It was perhaps a temporary lifeline, perhaps one that came with a significant, yet to be fully defined price, but it seemed the only one available to avert the immediate, pressing disaster engineered by the vanguard. Meanwhile, on the ground, seemingly unaware of the high-stakes game being played above them, the situation worsened. The vanguard, proceeding with their plans, intensified their activities. Their operations were not limited to pursuing insurgents. They became increasingly focused on areas controlled by the government. Incidents of suspected, friendly fire against Cumbrance military patrols increased. Patrols being ambushed shortly after their positions were shared in joint briefings, or coming under fire from directions where vanguard assets were known to be operating. Vanguard drones, advanced and virtually undetectable by Kambara's aging radar systems, buzzed over government buildings, military installations, and even Traoré's private residence with an unnerving sense of impunity. The message was becoming clearer, louder. We are everywhere. We are watching. We are in control. Your defenses are obsolete. Your sovereignty is an illusion. At the vanguard's main operating base, nestled behind high walls and layers of electronic countermeasures, Commander Hayes felt a different kind of shift in the air, a growing tension that was not tactical but strategic. He was receiving new intelligence assessments, reports that made little sense initially, then sparked growing alarm. Patterns of unusual air traffic in neighboring international airspace. Electronic signatures detected that weren't hostile insurgents, but belonged to sophisticated intelligence platforms. Naval movements in the Gulf that were not routine. All of it pointed to an increased and unexpected level of activity from a particular global player, Russia. He dismissed the initial reports as anomalies, or perhaps unrelated posturing. But the reports kept coming, more detailed, more persistent. And then, his own systems began experiencing disruptions. The response from Moscow finally materialized, not with a bang of arriving troops, but with the subtle, strategic pressure Traoré had gambled on. Putin's protection didn't arrive in the form of an expeditionary army establishing bases across Kambara. It came in the form of a calculated, calibrated application of geopolitical weight, a distinct message that the ground rules in Kambara were changing. First, there was a significant, immediate increase in shared intelligence. Russian satellite imagery, electronic intercepts, and human intelligence began providing Kambara with detailed, real-time information not only about insurgent movements, but, crucially, about the vanguard's deployments, operational plans, and communication networks, information that had been consistently denied or heavily filtered by Western sources. Traoré and Aminata could see, for the first time with startling clarity, the true extent of the vanguard's surveillance capabilities, their operational readiness, and the details of Operation Clean Sweep. It was a terrifyingly detailed picture, but seeing it, understanding the threat fully, was empowering. Next, there was the swift, discreet delivery of material. It wasn't the massed, heavy armor of a conventional army, not tanks or fighter jets arriving in waves, at least not initially. But it was critical, targeted defense equipment that addressed Kambara's most glaring vulnerabilities. Compact, mobile electronic warfare systems, sophisticated enough to disrupt communications, jam GPS signals, and, most importantly, interfere with the control systems of drones and precision-guided munitions, the Vanguard's technological edge. Advanced surveillance equipment that didn't rely on external data feeds. Much-needed ammunition and spare parts for the existing, often dilapidated, military equipment, much of which was of Soviet/Russian origin and incompatible with Western supplies. The flow wasn't enormous, but it was precise, impactful, and rapid, arriving via unmarked cargo planes at military airfields under strict secrecy. But most significantly, the true core of the shield was the layered political and diplomatic gesture that followed. Moscow, through its foreign ministry and UN representatives, began making increasingly pointed statements. They didn't explicitly name the Vanguard initially, but issued unequivocal declarations about the importance of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of African nations and the dangers posed by the presence and activities of certain irregular foreign armed groups operating outside the clear authority of host governments under the guise of counterterrorism. These statements were diplomatic, yes, but their target was clear. They were accompanied by actions. Russian naval vessels conducted highly publicized exercises in the Gulf of Guinea, close enough to major shipping lanes and potential access points to Canberra to signal intent without being overtly aggressive. Russian long-range reconnaissance flights, operating strictly within international airspace, increased their frequency along routes used for aerial refueling and resupply for Vanguard bases. And, through back channels, intelligence exchanges, private diplomatic notes, carefully worded warnings passed via third parties, a direct and unmistakable message was delivered to Washington and the corporate entities funding and directing the Vanguard. Any direct military action against the recognized leadership of Canberra or its loyal state forces would be considered an attack on a strategically important partner of the Russian Federation, with potentially serious, unpredictable, and escalating consequences. This wasn't a simple threat of an immediate shooting war between superpowers in Africa. Neither side wanted that. But it was a significant, calculated elevation of the risk profile. It meant that Operation Clean Sweep, envisioned as a low-risk, high-reward, mostly uncontested operation against a weak, isolated government, was suddenly fraught with peril. It meant the Vanguard's forces, accustomed to operating in a permissive environment, could find themselves under constant, technologically sophisticated surveillance, their every move tracked. It meant they could be subjected to persistent, debilitating electronic interference that would blind their drones, cripple their communications, and potentially compromise their precision targeting systems. And, in the worst-case scenario, it meant they could become targets themselves, not necessarily of massed conventional forces, but of asymmetric, deniable actions supported by a global power, actions that would be far more dangerous and politically costly than anything they had anticipated in Canberra. At the Vanguard's headquarters, nestled discreetly within its heavily fortified perimeter, the atmosphere shifted from one of confident readiness to one of growing unease and frustration. Commander Hayes, a man whose composure was legendary among his men, received the new intelligence assessments, the reports of electronic interference, the warnings filtered down from higher command, with a mixture of disbelief and cold, professional alarm. The patterns were undeniable. The sophisticated jamming, the sudden appearance of unknown signals, the clear warnings from Washington, it all pointed to a direct, unmistakable intervention at the strategic level by Russia. His faith in the technological superiority of his force, while not entirely broken, was severely challenged. They were prepared to fight insurgents in the bush, even engage a conventional army with outdated equipment. But they were not prepared to operate under the constant, active scrutiny and technical interference of a peer competitor superpower, where even a minor tactical engagement could suddenly spiral into a major international incident far beyond the scope of their mission. Their sponsors in the US didn't want a messy, public confrontation with Russia in Africa. They wanted a quiet, effective outcome. The strategic scenario had fundamentally changed. The risk now far outweighed the potential benefit of removing Traoré. The order came from Washington, filtered down through the complex chain of command, couched in layers of diplomatic doublespeak and military jargon, but utterly unequivocal in its core message: Operation Clean Sweep was cancelled. All vanguard forces were to immediately cease offensive operations directed at the government of Kambara or its loyal forces and, gradually and discreetly, prepare for redeployment from the country. In essence, stripped of the jargon, retreat. For Commander Hayes, it was a bitter, galling blow. Years of planning, months of preparation, the complex logistical effort of building the base and positioning the assets, the sacrifices made by his people, all undone, not by defeat on the battlefield, but by a geopolitical chess game played in distant capitals, by forces he could not engage, could not even fully see. He gathered his key officers in the operations center. The frustration and disbelief in the room were palpable, a heavy silence punctuated only by the hum of the sophisticated equipment. "Gentlemen and ladies," Hayes began, his voice tight with suppressed anger and disappointment. "We have received new directives from higher command. Our operations against, well, you know who, are suspended indefinitely. Our mission here has fundamentally changed. We are to cease all offensive planning and begin preparations for a phased withdrawal from Kambara." He avoided using the word retreat, preferring redeployment or withdrawal, but no one in the room was under any illusion. A young intelligence officer, usually stoic, raised his hand, his face etched with confusion. "Commander, but why? We were on the verge of executing the final phase. We had the assets in place. We were ready to—" "New variables have entered the equation, Lieutenant," Hayes interrupted sharply, cutting off the dangerous line of questioning. He couldn't explain the full scope of the Russian diplomatic and technical pressure, the direct warnings issued at the highest levels. Not to them, not now. "The strategic landscape has shifted dramatically. Our objectives, well, they have been redefined by those above us, taking into account factors beyond our operational purview here on the ground." He left the implication hanging in the air. Forces larger than theirs, directives higher than his, had intervened. The news, though initially confined to the command structure, spread through the vanguard's base like wildfire, carried by the invisible currents of the grapevine. Soldiers, contractors, support staff, many of whom had bought into the narrative of bringing stability to a failing state, of being the indispensable force holding back the darkness, and who viewed Traoré as an incompetent, obstructionist figure actively hindering the goal, were indignant, angry, disillusioned. Retreat? After everything they had invested? After the risks taken? To pack up their advanced equipment and leave the insurgents still operating, the country still unstable, and a leader they mistrusted still in power? Where would they go next? Another dusty, dangerous corner of the world? The process of withdrawal was not a sudden, chaotic exodus, but a carefully orchestrated series of movements designed to minimize vulnerability and maintain operational security, albeit a frustratingly slow one. Equipment was meticulously packed, some shipped out, some left behind for other purposes or partners. Forward operating bases deep in the countryside were systematically dismantled and abandoned, their sophisticated listening posts and surveillance arrays powered down. Helicopters that had once zipped freely across the skies, their loud rotors a familiar, intimidating sound, now flew more cautious, less predictable routes, constantly monitored by the nagging electronic anomalies and the unnerving, persistent feeling that they were being watched by eyes they could not see, tracked by capabilities they could not jam. The advanced surveillance drones that had once spied on the presidential palace and the capital streets were now largely confined to perimeter security around the base, or were being prepared for shipment, their surveillance capabilities effectively neutralized by the unseen hand of Russian electronic warfare. In the towns and villages of Kambara, the news of the vanguard's impending retreat began as a hesitant whisper, carried on the wind and the unreliable currents of rumor. Then it grew into a wave of cautious shock, and finally, in many places, blossomed into a wave of quiet, disbelieving celebration. The people did not understand the intricate details of the global power play, the names of Putin or the specific pressures exerted on Washington. But they knew that those armed foreigners, with their heavy vehicles, their loud machines, and their often indifferent or even contemptuous demeanor, who had often seemed more concerned with their own objectives than with the well-being of ordinary Cambarenses, were finally, slowly, undeniably leaving. Adama, the former schoolteacher who had converted her small home into a makeshift clinic and shelter for families displaced by the conflict, a conflict she felt had been exacerbated, not alleviated, by the foreign presence, saw the change reflected in the faces of the people who came to her for help. Less overt fear, a flicker of something akin to hope in their weary eyes. She heard the news on her crackling transistor radio, confirmed by frantic, excited text messages from relatives in the capital. The vanguard was leaving. Slowly, yes, carefully, but leaving. She didn't grasp the complex political maneuvering behind it, the strategic calculus, the delicate balance of power. For her, and for the countless men, women, and children she tirelessly helped, what mattered was the prospective absence of those intimidating patrols that swept through neighborhoods, the decrease in the unnerving drone overflights that felt like constant surveillance, the palpable sense that Kambara might, just might, be allowed to breathe on its own again, to chart its own course, however difficult that course might be. She knew with painful certainty that the insurgents were still a clear and present threat, that the crushing weight of poverty and the deep scars of instability would not disappear overnight. But the large, heavily armed elephant in the room, the foreign force that seemed to be actively working against the will of her own country's government, that seemed to prioritize its own distant interests over the lives of her people, was finally, blessedly, withdrawing. TRAORÉ watched the meticulous process of withdrawal through the lens of intelligence reports and satellite imagery, still arriving reliably from his new, unlikely partner in the north. He saw the photos showing convoys of the vanguard's distinctive vehicles winding their way towards the capital's airport and other departure points, the large American cargo aircraft waiting on the tarmac. The vanguard was, in fact, retreating. The Russian shield, applied not with direct military force, but with strategic pressure and technical capability, had worked. He felt an immense wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They had stared into the abyss of imminent catastrophe and managed to pull back from the brink. Kambara's sovereignty, battered and challenged on all sides, had been defended, not solely by the strength and sacrifice of its own people, but with the unexpected, controversial support of a distant global power. But the relief was not pure. It was profoundly mixed with the stark, chilling realization of the new, complex, and inherently dangerous reality that Kambara now faced. His country was now inextricably linked to Moscow. The vital help, the crucial protection that had saved his government from a devastatingly effective, externally sponsored intervention had come with a price. It wasn't a simple, transparent financial debt that could be paid off. It was a deeper, more complex debt of alliance, of influence, of strategic alignment. He had sought help to fend off one powerful, technologically superior predator, and now he had a new partner? Protector? Or had he simply acquired a new potential master, one with different methods, but potentially equally self-interested goals? He thought about what this new reality meant for Kambara. More Russian weapons would arrive, undoubtedly, perhaps advanced systems to better combat the insurgents, more trainers, more advisors. This would help strengthen the military, perhaps bring greater security to the north. But it could also further antagonize the Western powers, who had just been strategically outmaneuvered and publicly humiliated, potentially leading to renewed and intensified forms of economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or even covert destabilization efforts. And the dependence on Moscow, even if initially sought for the noble purpose of saving Kambara from foreign intervention, was still undeniably dependence. The long, difficult path to true, independent sovereignty felt just as steep, just as uncertain. Sitting at his desk, the late afternoon sun still beating relentlessly against the windows, Traoré knew with absolute clarity that the struggle for Kambara's true, unfettered sovereignty was far, far from over. The retreat of the vanguard was a significant battle won, a crucial moment of respite, a demonstration that even smaller nations, by playing the complex game of global power, could occasionally assert their will. But the larger war for the soul of his country, for control over its destiny, for access to its valuable resources, for its future trajectory in a fiercely competitive world, continued unabated. Now, the global chessboard upon which Kambara was played was more complicated, more dangerous, and had a new, powerful player moving pieces with their own agenda. Kambara was a crucial piece on that board, yes, but still a piece, vulnerable to being moved and contested by unseen hands in distant capitals. He thought of the families still living in terror in the insurgent-plagued north, the vast numbers of internally displaced people, the monumental challenges of rebuilding a country fractured by years of conflict and neglect. The external protection had ensured his government's survival and averted an immediate military coup. But it would not, by itself, feed the hungry, heal the wounded, rebuild the shattered infrastructure, or bring back the dead. That arduous work, the true building of a nation, was the responsibility of Kambara itself, and of Kambara alone. Traoré rose again, walking back to the map on his desk. The blue pins, the areas under precarious control, still far outnumbered the green pins of stability. They needed to become green pins. All of them. And he needed to navigate the treacherous waters of his new alliance, ensuring that the help he received, however necessary and effective it had been in this moment of crisis, served only the interests of the Kambaran's people, their peace, their prosperity, their dignity, and not ultimately become another chain binding his country to the will of a foreign power. However seemingly benevolent that power might appear compared to the immediate threat he had just overcome. It was a narrow path, fraught with constant danger. He had risked everything by turning, in a moment of extreme peril, towards the icy north in search of a shield against the suffocating heat of Western intervention and the immediate threat posed by the vanguard. The shield had appeared, effective and timely, forcing the strategic retreat of those who directly threatened his leadership and the fragile sovereignty of his country. But now, the true test began. He would have to navigate the complex, demanding relationship with his new protector, balancing their expectations and interests against his unwavering, fundamental promise to his people, Kambara first. The story of how the American fighters of the vanguard had to retreat, their advanced technology outmaneuvered, their plans thwarted, under the strategic and technical protection extended by Russia, was not a simple, triumphant narrative of freedom won. It was a story of survival in a cruel, multipolar world, where the concept of sovereignty is often a commodity, bought and sold or leased at a high price, where unlikely allies emerge from desperate necessity, and where the true cost of freedom and independence is measured not just in the blood of its people, but in the dangerous compromises and complex alliances a nation must forge to endure. IBRAHIM Traoré felt the immense, heavy weight of this truth pressing down on him, as tangible and pervasive as the red sand that covered his land. The vanguard was gone, their formidable presence receding like a mirage in the desert heat, at least for now. The immediate, existential threat of a coup orchestrated by an external force, of a direct, military-backed challenge to his government's authority, had diminished. But tomorrow brought its own set of challenges, its own lurking shadows. The fight for Kambara continued, on multiple fronts, against the insurgents in the north, against poverty and corruption at home, and on the complex, shifting landscape of global geopolitics. It continued under a new geopolitical sky, uncertain and potentially volatile, but now, crucially, illuminated by the hard, resilient hope of a people who, time and again, refused to surrender their dream of a truly independent future. This story shows how geopolitics directly affects people's lives on the ground, how decisions made in distant capitals have profound consequences thousands of miles away. Faced with such complex threats and conflicting international interests, what do you think was the most difficult decision for a leader like IBRAHIM Traoré to make in this situation? Share your thoughts and perspective in the comments section below. Traoré returned to his desk, his hand resting on the worn photograph of his family. He whispered a promise, a vow to them, and to the generations of Cambrenses who had yearned for true freedom. He had made the impossible choices, taken the controversial steps necessary to survive this battle, to keep Kambara from being completely subsumed. Now, he would have to steel himself and his nation for the many, arduous wars that still lay ahead, fighting for the very soul of Kambara in a world that seemed endlessly determined to control it, to shape it to its own will. The red dust, ever present, settling on everything, seemed to carry the weight of all the challenges yet to come, a constant, tangible reminder of the long, difficult, and uncertain path that Kambara still had to tread. If the complex journey of IBRAHIM Traoré, navigating the treacherous currents of global power and the hard realities of national survival, has resonated with you, if the interplay of geopolitics, sovereignty, and human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds has captured your attention, perhaps you would appreciate exploring similar stories of struggle, strategy, and survival in a complex world. Consider subscribing to the channel to join us for our next deep dive into the forces that shape our world.